the country is in good hands. But after only a few weeks, Macron is back to these catastrophically low figures, 60% of the population against him, and far more than that among the working class. Now, in the present crisis, unsurprisingly, Macron's central mantra is put companies first. So during the lockdown, 8 million permanent workers who cannot work by internet are being paid 80% of their wages by the government. After the lockdown, of course, companies will happily throw people out of work, and already there are terrible consequences. In contrast, there is almost nothing done to help people who cannot pay the rent, for example. In some countries, rents for poorer families have been frozen or cancelled even, but not in France. Many non-essential factories stayed open, and Macron's only half-successful push to reopen the schools too early is aimed at defending business interests, which need the parents back at work. Of course, there's plenty of money for big business. I think it was the economics minister, the finance minister, who said, talking about money available for Air France to prop it up, he said, everything is possible. His actual words, everything is possible. And Air France is receiving God knows how many billions. The electronic state chain store, Darty, has just received a state-guaranteed loan of 500 million euros, and the DIY chain Castorama, 600 million, and the furniture chain Conforama is hoping for 300 million. They've already said what they're going to use some of it for. They're going to pay redundancy pay for the 2,000 they're already planning to sack. So really, there are few real surprises in Macron's policies, but ideologically, it's very hard for his side. He's been claiming for years that what keeps France going is the startup mentality. That his heroes are, as he said, that small group who pulls everybody else up the mountain. And so reducing taxes for the rich and reducing state intervention in the economy is for him the exciting neoliberal future that we all need. And now suddenly he has felt obliged to keep the status quo in place, to decide massive unheard of state aid for companies. Hundreds of billions of for companies, but also billions of pounds for workers as well, because he can get away with doing nothing. And at the same time, the other ideological difficulty for Macron is right now it's very, very visible to people that the people who keep France going are not the big shareholders, but the nurses and lorry drivers and refuse collectors and supermarket cashiers and cleaners and bus drivers. So Macron does need to think over how can he get millions of voters of workers to vote for him again. He got 8.5 million votes in the first round of the presidential election in 2017. In the second round, he got 21 million in a second round runoff against Marine Le Pen, the fascist candidate. So I guess, like as I was saying, the crisis has shown up some of the vicious lies that capitalism is built on. For example, the state suddenly found a way to get most homeless off the streets and into hotels. They've been telling us for years it wasn't possible. But once homeless people became a health risk and not just suffering human beings, it was possible. So I think this is going to be something, he's going to have some difficulty with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also a really good general point, not just about France, but the fact that the crisis has brought up and brought to light some of the system's inherent contradictions, but also the fact that change is possible. And we've seen that with across the globe. But something else you said there, and I think what's interesting in the French context is how Macron is actually going to get the workers to vote for him again. So what do you think his strategy is likely to be in the next months, but also years?
Well, one of the things about unheard of historic crises is it makes it very difficult to know what's going to happen tomorrow. But I'll have a go. There are two key areas, really, the economic and the governmental. First, the economy. If the French state comes through this, it is going to borrow hundreds of billions of euros. Now, sooner or later, unless we overthrow capitalism, this will have to be paid back. And that's very, very simple. That means either more taxes for the rich or more suffering for the workers. Now, the top 40 French companies alone made 80 billion euros profit in 2019. That's just the top 40. So there's plenty of money around, but there are no prizes for guessing which Macron would prefer to help, the rich or the workers. His think tank friends are already suggesting that the economy is going so badly that we need to reduce the number of bank holidays. We need to reduce the amount of paid leave, all to keep France competitive in the world market. So that's one side of it. There'll be a lot of pressure, but there'll be pressure on the other side as well. He may well be obliged to make concessions. Take the question of the health workers. Every evening in France at 8 o'clock for months on end, people went to their windows and balconies to clap for the health workers. In my building, I can see from this window about 50 flats, and about a quarter of them were clapping every night. And there's no, it's a working class building. I've never noticed it being political before. Nothing like this has happened before. And now the unions have called a day of action in mid-June for the health workers, and it could be absolutely huge. There've already been demonstrations in front of some hospitals. So under all this pressure, there may well be substantial wage raises for health workers, much more investment in hospital, state support to stop some redundancies. He's been making surprisingly specific promises about health worker wages. He has been obliged to say publicly that he was wrong, and he wants to, quote, put an end to poverty wages in the health system. In record time, he set up a negotiating round with the unions, which started yesterday, and expectations are high. Now, there'd already been a wave of strikes in hospitals, desperate hospitals over the years, and now I'm expecting concessions. Macron has already promised this week considerably more money for services for old people. We cannot assume that there will not be significant concessions in the short term. Now, of course, any concessions he makes will also be mixed up with neoliberal priorities. More money for hospitals, but more space for private companies to get involved, more performance pay, more obsessive management. We know how they work. Now, the other side is the parliamentary side. Macron has lost his parliamentary majority just recently because a group of rebel MPs left his somewhat ramshackle party. He may move a bit to the left in the hope of forming a national government with other parties such as the Socialist Party. At the moment, a very weak party, which only got 6% of the votes in the first round of the last parliamentary elections, but a party with a very long history of bouncing back. So we don't really know what particular parties will do, but we know the general strategy, I should say, of the ruling class, which will be making workers pay for the prices by working longer hours, getting fewer public services, receiving lower pensions. You know, the capitalist leopard is not going to change its spots.
And that, I mean, of course, that may seem like an obvious point for many people watching, but I think there is a tendency as more and more people become politically active to project a rationality on capitalists that doesn't really exist. In fact, amongst those with economic power globally today, we've really only seen more attempts to exacerbate and extend neoliberal trends. But anyway, I think I want to move on a little bit to move away from French capital and move to French labour. So in response to a lot of these sorts of things, what has been the reaction of the French labour movement?
Well, France is a country where class conflict and class consciousness is higher than in most Western European countries. Now, right now, there's a huge amount of suffering because of the COVID-19 and the economic shutdown. Hundreds of thousands of short-term contracts have not been renewed. 8 million workers have been temporarily laid off. 3 million self-employed have seen a big fall in their income. 20% or more of low rent housing tenants have been unable to pay, and demand for food banks has gone through the roof. Now, where people are in employment, trade union organisation has been absolutely crucial. And now, incidentally, I will come back to that. This is the time for a massive recruitment campaign to trade unions. During the lockdown in several factories, workers' action obliged the bosses to close down, like in the car gearbox factory in Montluçon. In other factories, the trade unions managed to delay reopening. But nevertheless, Airbus continued making aeroplanes just outside Toulouse, and Michelin, the tire people, reopened some of their factories in April. Now, the CGT trade union has just carried out a big survey of 34,000 wage workers, and only 21% of those surveyed said safety measures like masks, gel, etc. were completely satisfactory. 40% said there weren't enough masks. 30% of those who were obliged to keep working during the lockdown said that their work was not essential. So everywhere, of course, profit tried hard to come before health. But union resistance helped a lot. The big freight depot just north of Paris, Géodis, who have 300 workers, they were provided with one canister of gel, and after a few hours strike, they won better protection. In the post office too, there have been strikes for safer working conditions. Trade unions took Amazon to court and closed them down on health and safety. What's the word? On problems of health and safety for a couple of months. Resistance from teachers delayed the reopening of schools and reduced class sizes to under 10 children in a class in most towns right now. Last week, bus drivers in Orléans went on strike for more frequent disinfecting. Next week in Lorient, the bus workers are on strike for better safety conditions, refuse workers too. There are quite a number of examples. I think it's really been a time when it's been more visible than usual that unionism is fundamental, that we need everybody in a union.
Okay, so then shifting away a little bit from the union response, what about left-wing organisations? What has been their reaction?
Well, there's a bit of a difficult time for left-wing organisations, who also are in France quite often not very centralised, not very disciplined. Of course, when you can't organise demonstrations and you can't have meetings, that makes things very, very difficult. So there's been a real paralysis. Now, quite naturally, it's easier for parliamentary parties or parties who have representation in parliament because they can get on the television, they can get their message out more easily. Now, my experience is that a large number of left-wing activists are involved in the food banks. There are 5 times more food banks than there were, along with trade unionists, Christians, Muslims, etc. There's a lot going on because there's a lot of hungry people around. In my town here, the Communist Party, the France Insoumise, and the anarchists are all involved in organising food collections, and as well as the Catholics and so on. Mm. Now, radical groups like the France Insoumise or the New Anti-Capitalist Party have been having online meetings, although not as much as in some countries. Some very good videos with representations from people in struggle. There's been a tiny minority on the far left foolishly campaigning against the lockdown, but that's rather anecdotal, but rather more people than I wanted to see doing that. So I think it's very, now the lockdown is being gradually lifted. We've just had another move today. The parks are being opened. The restaurant terraces will be open, and so it will be easier to organise resistance on the street. Although this does cause problems. I mean, there's been people, some small groups are organising illegal demonstrations. And not always in a very sensible way, because my own personal opinion is that you organise an illegal demonstration when you know you've got the muscle to put it through. And if it's just to find, you get 30 people together who are all picked up by the police, it might be better not to do it. Well, that's kind of a detail. These are complex problems as to organise demonstrations right now. But of course, that will come back.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to move a little bit away from the current crisis, but staying on the side of French labour and the labour movement. It's been something in France which has been really combative over the past decade, and this culminated last December with a huge mobilisation against Macron's neoliberal pension reforms. And when I say huge, if I'm not correct anyway, this was the biggest strike wave since 1968. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the strike wave and how successful that was.
Yes, well, the level of class struggle in France has been high for quite a number of years, really. But in the last 2 years, I don't want to go back too far, there have been 2 huge movements. First of all, the Yellow Vest movement, which started in October 2018, and its main phase lasted a year. That was a real inspiration. Rooted in the small town working class and self-employed, traditionally little mobilized, regions where the National Front, the fascists, get very high votes. This movement really transformed many thousands of people in the struggle. In my own working class French family in the Southwest, I found people who previously never talked politics were suddenly enthusiastically involved and arguing about tax policy and police violence and so on. Every weekend for over 6 months, without exception, including the Christmas weekend, the New Year Eve weekend, there were between 20,000 and 160,000 protesting. Macron was humiliated every Saturday by the Yellow Vests, whether they were blocking motorway toll booths, picketing tax-avoiding multinationals, or forcing their way into a ministerial office with a handy forklift truck. The movement had consistently more than 50% public support. And what they did is they managed to keep worker poverty and pensioner poverty on the front page. Government concessions were insufficient, but real. More money for minimum wage workers, less tax for pensioners, re-indexation of lowered retirement pensions on inflation, a moratorium on hospital closures. They were small but real, the concessions. And this movement also brought about some very, very surprising and inspiring examples of unity. Joint demonstrations were held between the Yellow Vests and the ecologists, the Yellow Vests and women's rights marchers, the Yellow Vests and campaigns against homeless workers, the Yellow Vests and striking teachers. Groups of black organized groups campaigning against police violence also joined with the Yellow Vests. Of course, there were people who got involved in the Yellow Vests who'd voted for the fascists in 2017. And this caused some people on the left to say, oh, you know, I wouldn't go near them. There's a lot of people who voted fascist. But the idea of building a mass movement among the oppressed, if you don't want to talk to any of the 10 million people who voted National Front, is just a ridiculous fantasy. Now, there were some weaknesses of the Yellow Vest movement, but it transformed French politics. And it was followed by an enormous strike wave against the slashing of pensions. Mass strikes in transport, on the docks, among refuse collectors and teachers, court workers, retail workers. 7 massive national days of action with millions on the streets. The transport half paralyzed for a month. And Macron was extremely determined. Despite all that, he was obliged to make a big concession. His new system, he had to announce, would not apply to everybody born after 1963, but to everybody born after 1975. That's a real concession. Nevertheless, the revolt went on. And when the coronavirus crisis hit, it wasn't finished, and some of his own MPs were saying, well, maybe we should bury this. And so when in the coronavirus crisis, he decided to shelve this reform, I think that counts as a victory for our side. If there hadn't been a fight back, it would already have been passed 6 months ago, done and dusted, and or would have been applying already to many millions of workers. So the major victory there. So that's the recent history that it is possible to have victories, even though the ruling class is extremely determined in this period.
Okay. So I think in general then you would agree probably a good takeaway message for anyone right now is join a union and tell your friends to as well. Because I think people actually more and more are realizing that they should have a say in their work life. And in order to do that, given the power that capital has, and in order to actualize that power, you need to be part of a collective. And it's all. I think this is an interesting point, actually, or an interesting moment to talk a little bit about the Dutch pension struggle, because just tomorrow, actually, the unions are going to announce the new pension system, which is going to come into place over the next few years in the Netherlands, and we believe that this will be aimed at moving towards a more individualized system, away from a collective system where workers have to select their own private pension, and the pension age, I believe, is to increase to 68 and then 71 at a later point. And like you talked about there, you mentioned that if the French workers and the labour movement had not been so combative, we would have seen Macron pushing through this deal 6 months ago. And that's just something that I feel like here in the Netherlands, a lot of the people involved in the labour movement are very envious of, because there isn't this same resistance. But I won't take up too much of the meeting talking, because this is we want to hear more from you. So just for anyone who is interested in the Dutch pension struggle, tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, we're going to upload a meeting which is going to talk a little bit more about this. It's going to be in Dutch. So you can check that out on our Facebook and our YouTube channels. So moving back into the discussion, like we say, we can take a lot of inspiration from the French labour movement and the workers' struggle more generally. But perhaps one area where there are some problems with the French left is with regards to Islamophobia. And I think, admittedly, over the past couple of years, there's been a shift in the relationship here. I think last year there was quite a large protest against Islamophobia, organised and backed by many leftist organisations. But from what I've read recently, up until not that long ago, there was a lot of acrimony in the French left, not only towards religious symbols like the headscarf, but also just to the term Islamophobia, claims to which never really received any sympathy. So I know you're quite passionate about this issue in particular. Can you tell us a little bit more about the French left's relationship to Islamophobia?
Yes, well, my badge here says the left must fight Islamophobia. Now, you only need to make badges like that in countries where the left doesn't tend to fight Islamophobia. I'm afraid that your account was a little optimistic. The wonderful demonstration last November was reluctantly supported by most left organizations. Right. Certainly not organized by them. Yeah, Islamophobia has been a historic blind spot on the French left, of which we should be very ashamed. There is a long tradition of hardline secularism which goes back a century, and generations of left activists have assumed that detesting believers is part of being on the left. It's very difficult to explain to people outside the country. So when in the 21st century the Cold War had ended and the new enemy on an international scale seemed to be certain groups of Muslims, the anti-religious nonsense in the heads of the French left turned very hard against Muslims. So quite often people on the left will say, oh, well, of course, I'm against all religions. But in a situation where it's the Muslims who are being hit on the head, refusing to defend them because you hate all religions is disgusting. So most of the left supported or ignored the Islamophobic laws of 2004, when high school students wearing headscarves were expelled from school. 2 years later, the major revolutionary newspaper in France wrote that there was no problem because there hadn't been a big fight back and the problem would have been solved. The front page of this revolutionary newspaper described a little later women who wear niqab, the face veil, as birds of death on the front page. So it's still pretty bad. Now, because the left will not defend Muslims, the question has become a perfect gift to the right. If they want to divert attention from social issues, they fabricate scandals. They fabricate scandals like the one about full-body swimsuits on the beaches 2 years back, and they fabricate the scandals. They know that the left won't really make a big noise, and so it's just a wonderful gift to the right. Now, it is true that the situation on the left today is better than 20 years ago. In 2004, the demonstrations in Paris against the Islamophobic laws on the headscarf, there were 200 people there, and I knew half of them. Now, last December, or November, December, I can't quite remember, many thousands marched against Islamophobia, singing adaptations of Yellow Vest marching songs. Still, most left groups only sent a few dozen people. The issue remains absolutely divisive and absolutely explosive inside the main radical left organizations, including the New Anti-Capitalist Party and the France Insoumise. And so the leaderships of the organization tend to avoid the issue like the plague because it's so divisive. Things are slowly improving, however. I checked out just before the meeting, and the joint slate, which was put together for the Bordeaux municipal elections 2 months ago, mentioned Islamophobia, the actual word, in its platform, which, you know, ought to go without saying, but in France doesn't. So things are getting better, but the leadership it's very, very slow. The question of banning full-body swimsuits on the beaches because of the dangers of extremist Muslims, which is the most ridiculous right-wing campaign I've ever done. There wasn't a single public meeting in Paris about it by any organization, any left organization, I mean.
It's good to hear that it's getting better, but I want to continue with the issue of racism and Islamophobia and talk about the current state of the far right and fascism in France. So in the political realm, the National Front received around 10 million votes in the last election, which, I mean, is quite terrifying, really. And although they lost, there was the ominous prophecy on the walls of Paris stating Macron 2017 equals Le Pen 2021. Do you think the National Front have consolidated this position? And do you think that this prediction is maybe likely to come true?
So I wasn't laughing at the National Front. It's 2022, the next presidential election.
Okay. But I think the actual slogan on the wall did say 21, so it was their fault, not mine. For getting
I'm sure that's true. The short answer is no. They have not consolidated the position. The RN, they changed their name from National Front to National Rally last year, or 2 years ago. They got 10.5 million votes at the second round runoff, which is more, of course, than they've ever got. Before the recent municipal elections, 14% of the electorate said they supported them. Now, what's happened is that the RN have been very successful in persuading a lot of the population that they're no longer fascist. Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, was expelled from the organization by his daughter because he could not stop himself from saying that the murder of 6 million Jews was just not important to him. But for a party that reached a peak of 10 million votes, the RN has not much managed to translate that into grassroots activists and structures. They can never get more than a few thousand out on a demonstration. In many towns, they cannot campaign openly at election time because of the anti-fascists. Now, at the moment, they claim 40,000 paying members, but they certainly have fewer activists on the streets than 5 years ago. Developing local routes is one of their key aims, and it's not going well. At the local elections 2 months ago, they stood in 262 of the bigger towns over 10,000. In 2014, the last time, they stood in 369. In 2014, they got over 10% in 317 towns. And in 2020, they got over 10% in only 136 towns. So they are having real problems in local implementation. Nevertheless, they had a victory for them, and horrible news for us, in Perpignan, 120,000 inhabitants, and they now control the local council, which adds them to. They have a few more local councils around the country, but that's the biggest. Now, why have they not managed to consolidate? Well, in the last three major episodes of the class struggle in France, it has not played well for the National Front. First of all, the Yellow Vest movements, repressed with extreme violence. The far right wanted to see this movement as a movement of the little people against the elites, and it was in the rural areas where they're stronger, and so they were hoping to be able to make the most of it, but they really weren't able to, partly because very many left-wing activists from the CGT, from the NPA, from the France Insoumise, from the Communist Party, different people were in there and arguing with people and drawing them away from the National Front ideas. But secondly, the big question around the Yellow Vest movement was police violence. Over 4,000 injured, much bigger violence than in most West European countries. The National Front, or the National Rally, cannot denounce police violence. More than half the police vote for them. They cannot denounce police violence, and so they couldn't really make something there. The second episode, the pensions strikes, it's the same thing. The whole idea of fascist ideology is, so let's get the small employers and some of the big employers and the workers, and then you have a national interest all in common. So they couldn't support the pensions movement to defend pensions. But it was so popular, they ended up with nothing to say because they didn't oppose it either, not loudly. So they were just paralyzed on that. And finally, today, with the COVID crisis, Marine Le Pen's popularity rates are up and down all the time, although 20% of those polled consider that she would have dealt with the crisis better than Macron. But her refrain is that the main solution for the COVID crisis is to close the borders. But people don't believe that. People don't believe that because they know how viruses work, you know. And so Marine Le Pen waxes poetic. He says, you know, our borders are like our skin. They are supposed to let in what is good and keep out what is bad, she said. But, you know, I mean, it didn't really carry very much. She also went into other claims that, you know, in the towns full of immigrants, they don't respect the lockdown. In fact, in the towns full of immigrants, there are far more people going out to work in the hospitals and as cleaners and as bus drivers, and that's why there's a higher death rate. Meanwhile, Le Pen resided in one of the several manor houses which she possesses. So she's struggling to be visible. Now, although far-right support remains worryingly high and a return to nationally based production could work for her, she has not had a good couple of years. But the central problem remains: if the radical left cannot produce a visible, popular proposal against austerity, the temptation of the far right will still grow.
That's all really fascinating. And I was thinking when you made the point about Perpignan, if I'm not correct, I think Perpignan has one of the highest rates of poverty in metropolitan France.
Oh, yes.
And this really brings to light the economic precarity, of course, itself an effect of neoliberalism and globalization, is so connected to the rise of right-wing politics. But anyway, bringing it back to something else you said, that being one of the big problems for the National Rally and Le Pen at the moment is that there are not the same levels of grassroots far-right activism at the moment. Do you mean this in terms of movements that the National Rally have specific ties to and networks built around, or just in general there's less right-wing, grassroots politics going on?
Yes, I think there is less. There is less going on. I mean, there's the small groups of fascist thugs, of Nazi thugs, who the National Front has, the National Rally has secret links to. But no, there's definitely less going on. They had the National Rally had great difficulty getting candidates to stand in the local elections, getting enough people to be candidates. The whole series of stories where they signed somebody up as a candidate and the person didn't even know. Things like that, and just while I just thought of one thing, that one of the things I like about Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is the most well-known leader of the organization which I'm supporter of, the France Insoumise, is that he was the guy who had the guts to go and stand against Marine Le Pen in her own stronghold at the parliamentary elections, whereas a lot of people who may have been more radical never had the guts. There you go.
Well, actually, on that, I want to kind of talk a bit more about your own experiences, which definitely relate to Mélenchon, because I think you have a very interesting political stance that really brings to light some important talking points when it comes to revolutionary practice. Now, you identify, if I'm not correct, as a revolutionary socialist, but you're also a supporter of the France Insoumise, who are left populist, but also somewhat nationalist and certainly reformist organisation. As a revolutionary socialist, first of all, why did you join them and not the anti-capitalist party, for example? And related to this, how do you reconcile the somewhat opposing positions of being a revolutionary on the one hand and engaging with reformist parties on the other?
Okay, that seems to be kind of three questions in one. What should revolutionaries do with reformism? What is the nature of the France Insoumise? I think the best translation for the France Insoumise is France in Revolt. And what should revolutionaries in France do now? Now, these are obviously huge questions which need to be widely and fraternally debated. So on the first question of being a revolutionary socialist, being a revolutionary is not a question of identification. It's a question of ideas. I'm a revolutionary because the present system, where all the big decisions are made based on what will make a profit, this system is not going to change. It's not going to learn how to abolish poverty, hunger and homelessness, even though there's more than enough money around. It's not going to fix the climate. It's not going to stop alienation being at the center of our lives. So we need a revolution. And revolutionaries have to be organized, so we need a revolutionary party. At the same time, most of a revolutionary's job is talking to reformists. The vast majority of workers think that we can change some things, but we can't get rid of the whole of capitalism. Reformist ideas are reborn again and again from the class struggle. And those revolutionaries, and sad to say we have quite a lot of them in France, who think that reformism can no longer exist, they're condemned to irrelevancy. We really don't need more revolutionary shopkeepers. Now, as for which organisation to join, well, any revolutionary socialist living in a country where there isn't a mass revolutionary party has to weigh up the strengths and weaknesses of the very smallish revolutionary groups. and where it is best to work. Now, I don't want to get into giving out good and bad marks to revolutionary comrades who are doing more stuff than I am. But I was a member of the new anti-capitalist party and its predecessor, the LCR, for 10 years. They have hundreds of excellent grassroots campaigners, but in my opinion, a number of key weaknesses. Firstly, it's an extremely federal organization. Each town does their own thing. So in the local elections 2 months ago, the new anti-capitalist party stood a joint list with the France Insoumise in Bordeaux. But in other towns, they were standing against the France Insoumise. And in others still, they called to vote for small Trotskyist sects, really. And this federalism became a real problem for me, that I think the NPA is more of a network than a party. Internal factions are very prominent in the NPA in a way that I personally don't find helpful. I would spend 3 weekends a year with my faction inside the NPA, long factional meetings. But the thing that made me leave the NPA with another bunch of people who also joined the France Insoumise was that the national organization and its newspaper are extremely sectarian against the new reformists, the France Insoumise. And if you do a quick Google search on their paper, it's literally the case that they only mention Mélenchon to denounce him. Whereas I think that the correct position is something like how the British socialist worker looked at Corbyn, that they defended whole chunks of his programme, defended Corbyn against the right, and at the same time patiently explained why Corbynism doesn't go far enough, why there is danger ahead, and so on. So that's my opinion. Now, what does the France Insoumise represent? Well, it doesn't have members, it has supporters. It's a network of supporters. You're allowed to be a member of a revolutionary party and a member of the France Insoumise, but quite a lot of people who are. There are two smallish groups inside the France Insoumise who produce a revolutionary paper. It's their right. So it seems to me that it's a good place to be because it's a big milieu, and yet you're allowed to express your own ideas. Now, personally, I don't think that left populist is a very useful description, although Mélenchon and his team do take some ideas from left theorists like, or left populist theorists like Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau. But when you look into more detail, I'm convinced that Mélenchon resembles Corbyn far more than he resembles other allegedly populist figures around Europe. Indeed, when he had a long 4-hour conversation you can find on YouTube with Chantal Mouffe and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and the huge differences between them were very, very clear. Mélenchon likes to repeat, the only limitation placed on exploitation is the resistance by the exploited. He speaks of a citizens' revolution. In a pamphlet he published last week, he said, our analysis, I've got it written up here, I've got some notes so I got it right, yeah. Our analysis is that the present period could end with a revolutionary event in which citizens take control over the power structures in society. But we are aware also that it could go the other way and end with a far tighter control over citizens by the power structures. Now, those are not my words, I'm a Marxist. But a team based on this kind of perspective that got 7 million votes, it seems to me worth taking seriously and working with. Now, I just want to say a word about nationalism and left patriotism. I don't think it's accurate to describe the France Insoumise as a nationalist organization. A section of the leadership goes in for a kind of left patriotism. They say the real French tradition is not colonialism and racism. This is how they put it. They say the fascists say the French tradition is about superiority and racism. We want to celebrate the French tradition of the Paris Commune and the French Revolution, Jean Jaurès, and the 1936 strikes. And so, just like the Yellow Vest movements, the leadership of France Insoumise likes sometimes to use the tricolour flag. There's plenty of problems with this approach, not least if you're using a tricolour flag and you're wanting to bring along all the Algerian-born and Tunisian-born workers. It can be pretty dodgy. But to pretend, as unlimited numbers of rather foolish journalists do, that this is the same kind of nationalism that you find in Le Pen is ridiculous. The France Insoumise has revolutionaries in it, but it's a reformist movement. It got 7 million votes on a programme very similar to Corbynism: nationalisation of energy companies, nationalisation of pharmaceutical industry and some banks, the end of nuclear power, a move to 100% renewable energy, the establishment of a maximum salary, a shorter working week, build 1 million low rent houses, leave NATO, bring retirement down to 60, free health service. This is it's a reformist program. It's a left reformist program. But I think it's an interesting place to be. And in the recent struggles, the 17 members of parliament of the France Insoumise have had a very positive role. They've kept the yellow vests and the pension struggles in parliament and in the television studios. At the moment, we're campaigning for masks to be distributed free and for it to be banned for 1 year to stop the money for unemployed people. That they wouldn't have them closed down. We're campaigning for funeral bills to be paid by the state for people who've died of the virus, and for limits to be placed on bank fees for people going into debt. Now, these are things where the members of parliament are playing, I think, a quite good role in bringing publicly simple demands. That could go. Now, the programme has plenty of weaknesses. There certainly is not a clear understanding of the role of French imperialism, that's for sure. And in fact, there tends to be a sort of the French state could play an extremely progressive role in the third world. That kind of discourse is around. But I think we can debate with them. I think it seems to me to be good to be in the France Insoumise, help popularising this programme, and certainly better than simple outside denunciation. It's very varied on the far left, but I had an experienced revolutionary say to me recently, Mélenchon is the enemy, he must be destroyed. And that kind of nursery school Marxism, it's a real danger. But then again, it's still a reformist organisation. The general problem of what the ruling class will do if a strong left reformist organisation gets into government is crucial. We have to work to prepare people. What happens if the France Insoumise gets dozens of MPs elected, but to form a government, they need to make an alliance with another party? What is an acceptable compromise? These are debates we need to be having, but the advantage of having them in the France Insoumise is that you can be talking to many thousands of people and not just to a few hundred. That's my take. Other people have other views.
All right. So, thank you for dealing with my combination question there. It was quite a big one, and I think I've only got time for one more myself before we move on to the questions for the audience. So to finish up, from my end at least, given what we've already discussed, just briefly, maybe you can say what you envisage happening over the next short period in France.
Well, I left my crystal ball on a train just before the lockdown, but let's say that many commentators are expecting a high level of conflict between the president of the rich and the mass of the workers. I already mentioned the health sector, but there are many more. Macron's new neoliberal attack on the universities is going into parliament in a week or two. That's been restarted. And a huge wave of redundancies across the economy, along with rising hunger, means there will be resistance. Renault has just announced 5,000 redundancies. Airbnb, Uber, André, the shoe people, La Halle, I can't remember what they sell, General Electric, Air France, they've all announced job cuts. But there's also resistance. The international private care home company, Corian, faced with a fight back, has just been obliged to give a €1,500 bonus to all its workers. So there's plenty of work to be done, both building resistance and building clarity about what capitalism can reform and what capitalism can't reform, and how to overthrow the dictatorship of profit. I think we need sharp and flexible people making a lot of noise and making a lot of mistakes and asking a lot of questions. And certainly we don't need to be turning in on ourselves and staying with pure revolutionaries in a pure little space.
Okay, so I've got a couple of questions for you from the audience. First one from Ava is a big one, so I'm just going to read it out actually, I think, and it's about the union response to the pension struggle. So he asks, can you explain a bit more about the relation between the leadership of the larger unions and the rank and file during the pension struggle? Because a lot of pressure was coming from below in order to prevent the leadership agreeing with Macron's rotten compromises, To what extent was the rank and file from the unions operating and coordinating in an organised fashion? And what are the relations with the radical left? Are the Anti-Capitalist Party and La France Insoumise intervening in the union struggle?
Funny you should ask that. Now, the trade union leadership in France is complex. And I think it's a very interesting question, because we have our general theory about union bureaucracies. Yeah, that is that the union bureaucracy is a specific social level, professional negotiators who will always, in the end of the day, want to keep some form of status quo to give them a role. That doesn't mean that they're the same in every country. It is typical in, I know, in Australia and Britain, for national union leaders to earn a very big salary. That is not the case in France. I can't remember the exact figures, but I think that the national leaders of the CGT earn twice what I do. Not, whereas in Britain it would be like 20 or 50 times. So that does make a difference. In the pension struggle, there were quite a lot of the regional leaderships could be very, very combative. The national leaderships were intermediate. On the one side, they'd say, we hope the struggle gets generalized. I'm talking about the more left-wing unions, the CGT. But at the same time, they wouldn't really build a national strike. And their biggest, things happened every day, but their biggest, what's the word, mistake, or maybe not mistake, the worst thing that they did, including the CGT leadership, is that they agreed to join a national conference to talk about the funding of pensions. And this was, in fact, just a disgusting propaganda ploy, but that defused the rising movement. Even the CGT, yes, oh yes, we'll join this conference in 2 weeks' time, and then of course it came to nothing. But that sort of thing, that at the end of the day, negotiation is central to them. And now the rank and file, certainly the far left, the left reformists and the revolutionary left were very much involved in rank and file organisation. Some of it was quite inspiring. In a number of towns, there were citywide networks of trade unionists getting together every couple of days to organise collaboration locally between teachers and post workers and transport workers. So there was some like inter-union committees or inter-strike committees, which were really very, very impressive. And I think there's a lot to be learned from them, because of course you only see your own town during the struggle. But then after the struggle, I think there's a lot of studying to be done about how all that worked out. And it's also a rather specific situation, because I think only about 11% of the working population is actually a member of the union. So you get quite big mobilizations, and then you find out that some of the people organising the whole thing are not even members of the union. So it can be a little confusing, but certainly I think I've come back on what I know about the question there.
All right, thank you. I've got another one from Emma, and this is about the students and the universities, so it might be a good question for you in particular. She asks, what is the situation in the French universities now? Are the students a source of left-wing support of the struggles, of the labour struggles in particular, or does the right wing also find purchase in French academia?
Well, the first thing to remember about students in France is that universities remain not quite free, but I think it's 300 euros a year. So nothing like the situation for example, in Britain. So a very large number of students. It tends to be rather explosive. It tends to be rather unorganized and rather explosive. That is to say, in normal times, there's a very small number of students in the student union, very small number of students voting in student union elections. But when it explodes, and then you get the universities occupied and so on, sometimes for weeks on end. Now, of course, if this happens at 5-year intervals, it's a whole new bunch of students. In fact, they're not the same people anymore. So it can be quite explosive. The right wing is trying to get some purchase. I mean, the far right is trying to get some purchase, but they have some difficulty. Every now and then on my university campus, you have attacks by far right organizations. You're talking about organizations of a few dozen people but who are actually quite dangerous. So no, it remains a the universities remain a left-wing place, but this is also partly because there's also another kind of high-level university, the Grande École, which is more for forming the elites, and so they tend to. It's mostly working class in the universities, and indeed we've been working. My university has been organising to get food to hungry students this last month. That's how bad it's been. But yeah, that's my general answer on some of the political atmosphere in universities. A lot of the time, there's nothing political at all. You can go month after month after month without seeing a political poster on a university. But then you'll suddenly find the whole place occupied.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question as well, because of course we always think about France and the students and the famous revolt of '68. And there being a big connection there, and I think that here in the Netherlands, in particular, there isn't too much activism going on within the student movement, and there is a little bit of a purchase on the right within the universities as well. Even though also the tuition fees are nothing like the price they are in the UK. I think it's about €2,000 a year here. So.
There's also the question of the teaching staff, because I work in the university in France. People in other countries say, "Oh yeah, it must be full of Marxists." I think there's about 12 Marxists in all the French universities together. I've met them all. It really is no longer the case. And in fact, when people write theses, it's now become in history. It seems to have come into the fashion to write in the introduction, "I'm not a Marxist."
Right.
This is often written by people who don't know what Marxism is, of course. But,
Of course, that's interesting. I mean, you don't get that as much here, I don't think. But there's more of a liberal attitude where it's okay to be Marxist. We can just let everybody think the way they want, kind of thing. But anyway, we could probably talk about that all day, and we have a couple more questions to get through. Eddie asks if you could say something about the relationship between the unions and climate change. He says here the unions are slowly getting aware of this situation, and they're beginning to mobilize a bit on a national level, but it's still not very strong. So maybe you could say something about that about the unions in France.
Oh, you haven't got a question about sport, have you? Yeah, I'm afraid I know practically nothing about that, which certainly shows that it's not an extremely visible part of their activity. I would expect the main unions to sign different things about climate change from time to time, but no, I haven't seen it becoming a priority issue. I would expect to see some union banners on a climate change demo, but they and some of their leaders in climate change talk shops. But yeah, we're not seeing a lot of movement on that in France now. Okay.
And we have, I think, one more, maybe time for one more question. It's about, I think the ex-socialist party, Ramon, and whether or not you would be. It's about whether or not, why would you not have supported him? Because he also had quite pro-socialist policies, not in the Socialist Party sense, but in the more radical leftist sense.
I'm not sure who you're talking about, actually.
I'll just give me 1 second. I think he was the leader of the Socialist Party until very recently, and then he broke off with another party. Does that not ring a bell?
Oh, sorry, Benoit Hamon.
Well, yeah, yes. Hamon. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, it's my pronunciation is not.
That's fine. He has set up his own party, which is. It's the sort of people who you would expect to work with in different campaigns. It's very much more a party which is concentrating on elections and getting positions in local councils and working through the institutions. And so it's not that they're not the sort of people we come across much when we're trying to organise struggles. But I wouldn't be hostile to them. I mean, I wouldn't be tempted to join the organisation, partly because it's much more disciplined. You wouldn't get away with writing you can sell your revolutionary paper inside it. If I had one, I wouldn't be able to. But I mean, certainly I wouldn't be hostile to them, because the Socialist Party exploded under social liberalism. Yeah? Hollande came into power, did promising left-wing things and doing 2 left-wing things and 23 right-wing things, and that exploded the party, which is why they were the government, and then they had parliamentary elections and got 6% of the vote. After being the government 3 weeks before, I mean, it's absolutely unheard of crisis. I mean, I don't know of any other party in Europe that has ever had that kind of crisis. You're the government and then you're 6%. Oh dear, it's an absolute collapse. Now, they have a long history of bouncing back. I don't believe people who say that they're dead forever. But it's an important point, because I think there's still a lot of space for reformist organizations, and they might be occupied by left reformists or by right reformists, but reformism is definitely not going away, because it doesn't go away until you have a revolution. It's a permanent feature of capitalism. Now, unfortunately, there are Trotskyists who have theorized the idea that reformism could no longer exist. And I think that's a theoretical argument, but it's something which I think is really tremendously dangerous, because I've met a few of them in France, and so their analysis is that Mélenchon is pretending to want to change things. Yeah, he can't be a left reformist because reformism doesn't exist, so he's just pretending. And so this is what I call nursery school Marxism. Yeah.
Right. Well, okay, I think that's then a good point to finish up, because we don't have any more questions by the looks of things from the audience. But we don't have much time for that anyway. So thank you. I'd like to thank you, John, for coming on. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. And
it was good to be invited. It was good to be invited. Good luck with building your organization.
Well, thank you. And on that, we actually we have, as I've said, we have the Dutch Pension Struggle meeting, which goes online tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. And we have a few more meetings to come in this Marxism Festival series. First up on Sunday at 1 o'clock, we have a reading group, which is on socialist feminism for the 99% and social reproduction theory. That reading group will be in Dutch. And then next week at this time, at 8 o'clock, we have an English reading group on Marx's contribution to ecology. So for those interested in the climate movement, this will be of great interest. And if you want to check these events out, you can look on our Facebook page for more details. And we also have a monthly newspaper, which I'm going to mention about, which is in Dutch, and you can find out more information on this over at our website at socialisme.nu. And that's all from us. So until next time, comrades, thank you for joining us. Thank you, John. Yeah. Ciao.
Yeah.